Hi, my name is Simon Bennett. I'm the ZAP founder and project lead, and this is a series of training sessions I'm giving for the folks at Stackhawk. So the last couple of sessions I talked about, gave an overview of ZAP and then introduced the ZAP desktop. And what I'm going to do now is start delving into exploring applications. And what we do in ZAP is we try and have a distinct difference between exploring the applications and attacking them. We do this for various reasons. One is, well, they are conceptually very different kind of things. And two is there are lots of different ways you can explore an application. And that the different ways work in different circumstances, so there's no one best way to do things. And also your application can change over time as well, because when you perform actions on it, then new things can happen. So we want to, as we can split these things, that means it makes ZAP very flexible, but it also makes ZAP a bit more complicated when you're new to it. So when we're exploring an application with ZAP, we've got different options. One of which, the most effective way probably, is to actually explore an application manually. And probably the best thing to do is for me to start sharing my screen now. So I've got ZAP here, and what I'll do is, so we've got these options here and on the quick start screen, and one of them is the manual explore. And what this allows us to do is this allows us to launch browsers from ZAP. What you typically have to do is you need to have I think I mentioned this last time, but you need to proxy your browser through ZAP, and you need to import the ZAP root CA so that ZAP can intercept HTTPS comms. Now, that's always a bit of a pain, so we have this way of launching browsers, and we can launch any modern browser, which really means Firefox and Chrome. And when you launch it, the browser will come up, you will start, you'll see your application, and you can start exploring it. And as you explore it, then what will happen is all the requests will get proxied through ZAP, and we'll start seeing the application being built up in the site tree. So we say that manual exploring is usually the most effective way, because most of the time, well, a lot of web applications, if they should be aimed at human beings, people to actually, who will actually use them. Of course, that doesn't apply to APIs, but I'll get to those in a bit. So exploring them manually with a browser is usually very effective. The problem is that you're doing it manually. You need somebody sitting there clicking through. You might miss things, so it's good to have backups. But also, when it comes to automation, that's no good at all. So the manual approach works well if you're doing manual testing, but not if you're automating it, which is not really too surprising. Another option you've got then is if you've got a good set of unit tests. So unit tests which drive a browser, which then drive your application. All you need to do is proxy those through ZAP, and it'll be pretty much the same as exploring the application manually. That does depend on you having good data, though. And one of the reasons we say manual or proxying unit tests is a good approach is because that way ZAP gets good data. And what I mean by that is, imagine you've got a form where it's like register a new user. So ZAP can fill all this information in because we can see what the form has, but there'll be a field username, and ZAP will probably put ZAP in. And then the application may return an error saying the username must be an email address. Now, that's something a user can go, okay, I need to put zap@test.com or whatever, but an application, it's much harder to detect those kind of errors that applications return, because there'll probably be a message rather than an HTTP response. And even if we did get an HTTP response, it'd be difficult to tie that back to a particular field. So human beings are much more effective at navigating applications designed for humans and acting on the responses they get. If we're talking about APIs, that's very different, and then that's where it's useful to be able to import APIs so we can import Open API. We've got a SOAP add-on which is currently being fixed. We've got a GraphQL one which is quite new, and we can import URLs as well. But what, it's very useful to have an option to explore applications that are designed for humans, but where you don't want somebody to actually sit there and click through everything. That's why we have the spiders. So we actually have two spiders, and my plan is to just talk about the traditional standard spider today. And I think the next session we'll get on to the Ajax spider. So the traditional spider it's a standard web crawler. So it makes requests and it looks at the HTTP requests and responses and then finds more URLs. And the good thing about it, it's very fast and very effective, but the problem is it doesn't handle modern web applications that make heavy use of JavaScript very well. And that's why we have the second Ajax spider. So there's different ways of actually starting the traditional spider. We do have this automated scan option, and here you can see you've got the option to use, the default option uses traditional spider, and you've got an option to use the Ajax spider, but that kicks off the attacker, the active scan as well. We do have the option, if you go to tools, there's the spider option there, but we also have a spider tab down here, and you can just click on the new scan and you'll get the spider dialog. We can also right click on any node in the sites tree or any URL in the history, and we will then get an attack dialog, which sometimes my mouse has problems with, and we can click on spider there. In each case, we end up with this spider dialog. So the initial dialog is very simple. We just have a starting point, and we've got an option. So if you actually want to go and change it, change it from the sites tree, you can change it there. And then we have a context, and the context pull down is only enabled if this URL is actually in one of the defined contexts. This one isn't, so we don't have that option. If we did have that, then the spider would actually follow all of the URLs in the context and would not go outside that context. Where as it is, we will just start at this particular point and go on from there. We also have a pull-down option for the user. This is only available if one, you've chosen a context, and two, you've got any users in that context. We then have an option for a curse, and this is basically the URLs we're seeding the spider with. So at the moment, if I use the localhost option here, sorry, the starting point, then if I don't recurse, then we would only actually seed the spider with those URLs. So it's quite possible we'd actually miss budget because it's not actually linked from the top level. The spider subtree only means that we won't go, so if we select budget, then we shouldn't actually go back up at all. We should only go down, even if there are links outside subtree. And the advanced options I will show you in a minute. But I've selected budget, and I'll start the scan, and we'll see very quickly that ZAP actually spidered the application. So what we see within ZAP is we have quite a few tools where we kind of call them scanners, and they are asynchronous operations. So you start it, and it then carries on for a period of time, and you usually get some sort of progress bar or indication that it's still running. And we actually have at the bottom here, we have this current scans, and you might have seen very quickly that there was the spider there went from 0 to 1. If I actually start from if I just do a new scan and start from localhost, if I start that again, you'll see it takes a little bit longer. We found more things. So we've got one scan is progressing, and yeah. And we've got options for kind of pausing the scan and stopping it as well. Now, one thing you might have noticed is that this time that progress bar wasn't linear. So it kind of shot up for a bit and then shot down and shot up again. One of the problems of this with spidering is you never know how far you've got. Imagine if you've got a URL and you find 10, the first URL you look at, you find it has 10 URLs underneath it, then you might, you'd think, okay, we've just started, and you then crawl the first URL and you think, well, I'm 10% of the way through. And then you crawl the next 9 URLs and you think you're 90% of the way through. But the fact is those, it might be that those first 9 URLs have very few children, and it's the last URL which is really, really deep. So you might start crawling that and realize you're only, 50% through, and then you realize you're only 10% through. So what you'll see is this progress bar, if you're scanning a large application, will, you'll start progressing quite quickly, and then the progress bar will drop back as we find new URLs that we need to scan. So the progress bar is kind of a bit of a, it's a guess as far as, it's the best that ZAP can do with the information that it's got. What we also have in this tab down here, we can see how many scans you can actually have. As many, we can kick off multiple spiders. You can have many at the same time. This will probably slug your machine quite a bit, but you can see the past results as well, and you can see how many URLs they found and how many nodes were added, because you might find loads of URLs but only add you can see here we found over 1,000 URLs, we'd only added just under 400. And we can see the nodes and the messages as well. So with the messages, you can actually then see the request responses. So you can see all the details, so you can see exactly what ZAP is doing. So what I want to do is now, you've seen those, the basic spider, and what I want to do now is show you the advanced options. So a lot of these dialogues have these advanced options, and in this case the spider's got quite a few options. So the first one is the maximum depth to crawl, and this is depth down the tree. So this is really, here we've got budget is one node, and then we've got images is another node. So really that advanced option will control how far down you go, and by default we go to 5. And the next one is the number of children to crawl, so that's the immediate children of each node, and by default it's unlimited. And then we have a maximum duration, which again by default is unlimited, and its duration in minutes. And what all these 3 controls allow you to do is to speed up the spider. So it's quite possible that your application is particularly large and you might want to either do a very quick scan, or you might know that there's quite a lot of content which is duplicated or data driven. So being able to control these kind of aspects of the spider allows you to speed up your scan. And what you can do is you can actually set these at a lower level initially and then increase them later on if you want to do more detailed scans. So you could have different profiles where you scan, you have a much quicker spider and a slower one which you do less frequently. We then have a set of options for whether you want to send the referrer header, accept cookies. Process forms is quite an interesting one. So this is turned on by default. And we've actually got one of the frequently asked questions about this, because what a lot of people ask is whether just spidering an application is dangerous or not. And that always depends, because if the process forms is turned on, like it is by default, then you often find that ZAP will find a contact us page, and so you may find that ZAP actually ends up sending loads of messages because it's just exploring the application, spidering it. It will send a lot more if it actually attacks the contact us page, but once that's happened, it's usually a bit too late. You usually have to prevent ZAP from actually submitting, though, either posting forms or take that out of the spider, which I'll show in a bit. Then we got various options for parsing HTML comments, parsing robots.txt and sitemap.xml, and then parsing SVN, get data, and handling OData parameters. So those are the advanced options, and those are applied on every single scan, so you can change them. And if you click on the help here, which will appear in my other window, it will give you information about those. But we also have some options associated with the spider, and these are available via the standard options dialog or that gear icon on the spider tab. And quite a few of these are actually very similar. So we've got the maximum depth to crawl, number of threads used. So this is different. By default, I'm using 2 threads, and this is one where it's a performance thing, and it depends on the size of your machine. So if you think you've got a particularly powerful machine and your spider's taking too long, then you might want to increase the number of threads. And if ZAP is, if your machine is struggling, then you might want to reduce that to just 1 thread. Again, we've got the duration number of children to crawl, and actually I think I missed this one, the maximum size to parse in bytes. So this is the size of the response, and what the spider will do is the spider will parse every response. And if you've got particularly large downloads on in your site, on your application, then ZAP may, or the spider may struggle and may take quite a bit longer. So this is an option to actually let ZAP ignore particularly large responses, and that's the default we've got. We also have an option to add domains that are always in scope, because the spider will not go out of scope by default. So you actually have to, so here you can give it a set of domains that you want to always include. And we've got various options for, so we're sending the referrer header again, accepting cookies. And we've actually got how to handle query parameters. So you can either consider both the parameters name and value, or only consider the parameter's name, or ignore parameters completely. And the rest looks like pretty much the same. We've got a bit more detail here, so you can choose to submit get or post forms. But that's pretty much all of the advanced options. Is everyone okay with that so far?
I'm curious, the parse HTML comments, how does that influence the spider?
So it's quite possible that comments actually have URLs in them, particularly things like, I've seen ones before where there are, functionality that's been disabled or something like that. So the spider will detect those by default, which is quite nice. So what I was going to do now is actually talk a bit about the API. So what I'll do is I will launch a browser again. This time I'm going to point it directly at ZAP, and I usually kind of introduce the API completely separately, but having talked with the folks here at StackHawk, we thought it might be better if I kind of do a bit more of a deep dive on each feature. So if you point your browser directly at ZAP, then you'll get this menu, and there is, I'll actually go back to the options. There are various options related to the API. And what I've actually done is, by default, the API is enabled, and this web API is enabled as well. There are some unsafe options, one of which is disabling the API key. I've done that here because it makes my life easier and I'm in a safe environment, but don't do that if you're using ZAP with applications online. So what you'll see if you point your browser directly at ZAP is this page, and the first link is the local API. So what you'll see here is all of the components that support the ZAP API. And if we go into one of the key ones is actually core. So go into core, and there's loads of things. And what you'll see is we have views, and views can just look at things. Then we have actions, and then we have other things which don't return structured data. Actions and views all return structured data. And one of the things I want to do is show you how to use the spider, and it'll be kind of useful to have a new ZAP session for that. So what I'll do is go to core and look at actions, and we want a new session. And you can see it's got a name and an overwrite option, but neither of these are actually mandatory. So I can just submit that, and you'll see in the background there's a completely new ZAP session. But what I want to do is actually just copy this URL for reasons that will become obvious later. So I'll just paste that somewhere else. And then what I want to do is go back and have a look at the components again, and we'll see that we have a spider component. And again, we've got loads of views, and you'll actually see that a lot of these, so anything that starts with option is probably automatically generated. And we can see things like option max depth. So if we have a look at that, we'll see the maximum depth is 5, which is not too surprising. That's what the default was. But we then have actions, and we look down here, we've got a couple of scan actions. So one is scan, one is scan as user. I haven't set up any users yet, so I'm just going to click on the scan. And we do need a URL. So I'll put budget in, and we shouldn't need anything else. So again, have a look here, and hopefully I've got everything right. Then we will see the spider has run. And we've got a load of, again, all of the URLs that ZAP has found. And one thing you'll notice is that the API actually returns 0. So that is the scan ID. And again, I will just copy that URL. And what we can do is, if it actually took a bit more time, then we could have seen its status. So we go back here, and we will see we've got a status. And again, it's got an optional scan ID. So I'll put 0 in, and we'll see that's 100%. And one of the advantages of the ZAP API and this web UI is you can actually play around with it from the command line as well. So if I plot the command line, then what I've got is keep an eye on the ZAP background. So I should just be able to go curl and put that in quotes because there's an ampersand in it. I keep on forgetting to do that, and then it complains because it doesn't make any sense. So I'm just going to curl the URL that I copied from the web UI and have a look at ZAP in the background, and we will see we've now got a new session. I'm going to then do exactly the same with the request for the spider. So curl quote, and that's the request for the spider, and have a look at the ZAP, and don't know if you can see down there, there's the little spider icon as well. See, that goes to 1 and then goes to 0. And we can see we've got the scan ID has been returned as well. And so we can actually then copy from either window, and we'll go curl quote v, and scan ID equals 0. And there we can see 100%. So the ZAP API, we've got this web UI around it, and it makes it very easy to play around with it and to see what happens. And this works with ZAP in the daemon mode, but it also works with ZAP in the desktop. And that's fun because then you can see what's going on with ZAP. And if you're having problems automating ZAP, then it's often good to actually run your automation scripts against the ZAP desktop, because then you can see exactly what's going on and start diagnosing things. It's much easier to go, okay, I now, for example, want to start looking at some of these messages. Say you've got authentication set, you can now start going through and seeing whether the requests contain the headers you expect. You can do that via the API, but it takes a lot longer. It's much quicker to do that via the desktop. So I recommend using this kind of blended approach. And just to show that things do get updated, not just the scans, if we have a look at the actions, we can set into the options. So set the maximum depth. It was 5, I think, so we set it to 9. That appeared to work, and we go in, look at the spider, then hopefully, maximum depth has been set to 9. So you can use, there are some cases where the API won't update the desktop, but in general, everything that you do via the API will be reflected in the desktop. So it's a good way to see what's going on. And so that is a quick introduction to the API as far as the spider is concerned. Any questions on that aspect?
So ZAP the daemon and ZAP the API, are they running as the same service, or are they kind of running as separate pieces?
The desktop includes the API. So when you run in the ZAP in daemon mode, you get the same code. We just don't start the desktop GUI. So it's just one process if you're running a desktop and one process if you're running daemon. The desktop doesn't have a separate daemon process. What I wanted to do now was actually show go into a little bit more detail, because I think it's useful to just actually point at the code so you get an idea of where to look if you want to get involved. And what I'll do is I'll go to the ZAP website, and we have a link to GitHub here. And this is the GitHub org for ZAP. And you'll see we actually have 35 repos, so we've got quite a few. But the main ones are pinned at the top. And there's ZA proxy and ZAP extensions. So these are the kind of the main two. I'll talk about the others other stage. So ZAP extensions are all of the add-ons that we can update independently. So actually trying to move more code into ZAP extensions. But the ZAP core, as we call it, is in ZA proxy. And quite a lot of the functionality, some of the core functionality is still there, including the traditional spider. So if we go into there, we'll see a whole lot of directories, but the key one is ZAP. And you'll then see you've got Gradle and source. We go into source, we've got main and test. And if we have a look at main, then various things, including Java. And then we start getting to the code. So this ch directory, you typically don't need to look in there. So that's used for some few specific things. So org is where most things are. And then we have some Apache classes we've had to patch. Again, you don't normally need to touch those. You can see they were updated 6 months ago. But then we have the Paros branch package, and we've got ZAP. You can see the Paros one was updated 21 hours ago, and the ZAP one was updated 5 hours ago. The Paros one doesn't get new functionality, but there's a lot of the old Paros code in there, particularly around the structure of ZAP and extensions and networking and some of those core classes. So, you will need to actually get into the Paros code if you want to start playing around with the ZAP code base. But in this case, the spider is just within ZAP. So we have a look down here, we'll see a spider directory, but this isn't actually all of it, but I'll look in here first. So this is where we define some of the underlying classes. And one of the classes is this spider param. If you see any param classes, they're probably the parameters. So if I look here, remember we've got things like the maximum depth, the number of threads, processing forms. This is where all those options are defined. And these are the underlying options. And if we go to the top, you'll see these extend abstract param. So this means that these parameters get persisted in the configuration file, and a lot of that's handled for you. So that's why all the extensions use this abstract param for their parameters. But then a lot of the functionality is actually in this extensions package. And you'll see here all of the core extensions. And if we make any changes to these, that's when we have to do a new full ZAP release before we can get the functionality out there. If we change anything in ZAP extensions in the other repo, we can push those changes out at any point we like. But we've got the spider here. So this is where all the rest of the spider code is. And one of the key ones is extension spider. So if you see any code starting with extension, that's usually the entry point for that particular extension or add-on. So this is kind of the controlling thing for the spider. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just give you an idea where to start looking. One thing I typically do, if I'm not sure where to look for something, then I will typically actually go to the UI. I will find a particular string, and then I'll grep for that string. That will take me to the messages file where I'll get the key, and then I'll grep from there. So that's a pro tip if you're not sure where to look for things, and I often do that. And the only other thing I was going to mention now is that we do have, and I've talked about zaproxy.org, which has got all the latest documentation in, but the wiki actually does have a lot of useful information still. Some of it's out of date, but some of it is still very useful. And something was pointed out to me quite recently was you can look down here and look at internal details. We actually have a section for the spider. And so this was last edited in January, even though it's actually developed as part of Google Summer of Code 2012 project. So that was when some of this documentation was written, but you can see, we're keeping it up to date. So this actually then explains how the spider works. It goes through the core concepts and how you can extend the spider, and talks about the packages as well. So this is one of the great things about open source. You can go in, you can see how it works, and you can help improve it, and you can understand it and learn from it. So there's a lot of useful information there. So if you actually want to get involved in changing how the spider works or extending the spider, then do have a look at this particular page on the wiki. Pretty much all I wanted to cover. So any more questions?
One more question. Does the spider provide any additional functionality, just kind of features to the operation of ZAP, if the user has also provided an open API config?
No. So the Open API is it's a way of importing the Open API definition. So we, as you know, we've got a few add-ons which handle that, SOAP and GraphQL. So the those add-ons allow you to import those APIs. The spider doesn't really help because usually there's nothing for it to follow. So the traditional spider is looking for links. So
yeah,
I mean, it's possible that your API definition might include URLs, in which case the spider might help. But in general, I would say no.
Cool.
Yeah, essentially it's in lieu of doing the spider. You're just saying, hey, build the site tree from this, right?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends whether your application has both a UI aimed at humans and an API. If it's got that, then you'll want to use both. If it's just an API, then neither of the spiders will typically help.
Then I also wanted to ask, is there any particular ZAP functionality around using a sitemap XML file, or possibly generating another sitemap from the spider?
Yep, so we can actually, so wait a minute, let me share my screen again. If we have a look at ZAP, then in the spider options, somewhere down here, parse sitemap.xml.
Oh, nice.
So we will actually look for a sitemap and we will parse it by default. And the same goes for robots.txt. This is kind of ironic because robots.txt is, one of the uses is to tell crawlers to stay away from certain places.
Yeah.
But malicious actors and ZAP will typically use it to try and find more content. So we don't have a way of generating a sitemap.xml, but I would have thought that'd be pretty easy to write as a script. So I don't think there are any existing scripts for that, but that'll be a fun one to just for someone to knock up if anyone fancies having a go at that. But so ZAP has a very powerful scripting interface, and these are scripts that run within ZAP, and I will go through that in future sessions, more than one, I'm sure. But we've got this community scripts repo, which has got loads of examples you can play around with and rip off and contribute to. And we have this section down here for standalone scripts, and one of those will be traversing the sites tree. So have a quick look at that. That's how easy it is. So it's actually very simple to traverse the sites tree. So you could very easily generate, I'm sure we could generate a sitemap from that. We also have one for going through the history and all those kind of things. So we've got lots of fun scripts for people to play around with. Okay, well, great. Thank you very much. Next session will be the Ajax spider. May or may not get onto more than that in next session, but it'll be carrying on different ways of exploring our applications with ZAP. Okay, thanks a lot.